Hello, Joe.
Hey, Patrick. How are you today?
I am well, sir. Thank you.
Hey, thank you. Thank you for your service that you do for all of us truth seekers and for the events that you put on here in the city of Phoenix. I'm greatly
Thanks,
appreciative
Joe.
of that. My question today is I'm looking for a little bit of clarity about a topic. I believe they call it the Dubia. It was. Are you familiar with it?
Oh, am I familiar with it? Yes, I'm familiar with it. Mm-hmm.
Okay. So maybe you can kind of bring a little bit of clarity as to what it actually is about, and then I'm hoping to just kind of I guess formulate what's at stake or what that would mean in regards to our priests or how they carry the details out.
Okay, so why don't we start with what is the dubia? This was issued, I don't have the precise details, but it was about 4 years ago that 4 cardinals issued a dubia is a Latin word. It means a question that is based upon, it's doubtful whether we should understand something this way or that way or in another way. And so it is a regular thing that happens in the life of the church more or less constantly, in which bishops, for example, or priests, and perhaps even lay people, but it's typically going to be a bishop, would submit a dubia or dubium in the singular, and it's an interrogatory asking the Congregation for the Doctrine of the Faith, usually is the congregation that would receive these. Is this the right way to understand this thing in the church's teaching or the law or something like that? Is this the correct way to understand it? And so as a matter of course, the competent authorities in these Vatican dicasteries would respond with an affirmative or a negative. And it's very mundane and very common. This is not something unusual. So what prompted this particular query was when these 4 cardinals, in the aftermath of the release of Amoris Laetitia, which is the document or the encyclical from Pope Francis, that, among other things, talked about, in certain generalities, about divorce and remarriage, and whether or not people who are divorced and remarried should be permitted to receive Holy Communion. And there was a particular footnote that was so ambiguous as to be open to different possible interpretations. And so the dubia were a series of 5 questions saying, in essence, using this typical format, given this verbiage in the footnote of Amoris Laetitia, does this mean that, and then they ask the 5 questions, does this mean, for example, that Catholics who are divorced and then civilly remarried are permitted to receive communion? A very straightforward question. It would not have raised any eyebrows whatsoever in the years before, let's say, the last 7 years. And one would expect that the answer would be, no, you're not allowed to receive Holy Communion, because that's been the age-old teaching of the church. It's certainly what St. Paul says in 1 Corinthians chapter 11, when he says, if you are aware of being unworthy, and what he's referring to there is to be in the state of serious sin, then don't receive Holy Communion, because you are then guilty of the body and the blood of the Lord, which is a euphemism for murder. And then he says, and if you do not discern the body or recognize the body, as some translations say, do not receive communion, because if you do so, you are eating and drinking judgment or damnation unto yourself. So these 2 warnings that come straight from the Apostle Paul have always been understood in the Catholic Church to mean that if you, Joe Q. Public, if you are aware that you're in the state of serious sin and you haven't gone to confession, that you should refrain from receiving Holy Communion. So that's the first component of this issue. The second component is Jesus repeatedly said, and we heard it again just this past Sunday in the gospel, if a man divorces his wife and gets remarried, except in the case of sexual unlawfulness, and that doesn't mean adultery. What it means is if the couple is not actually lawfully married in the first place, Jesus says, if a man divorces his wife and remarries, he commits adultery. Serious sin. It can send you to hell if you don't repent of it. And that's followed by Jesus saying, and if a man marries a woman who is divorced, he commits adultery. So there, it's very plain And it has always been clearly understood for these last 2,000 years. And so when Amoris Laetitia was issued and this ambiguous footnote, which contained language that seemed to be open to the possibility, or even the likelihood perhaps, that divorced and civilly remarried people could receive Holy Communion, this sent off a lot of shockwaves and a lot of concern because, wait a minute, we have 2,000 years of history coming straight from Jesus himself and straight from St. Paul, and 2,000 years of consistent church recognition that if you are in the state of mortal sin, you're not supposed to go to communion until you go to confession, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. So that's what the dubia was intended to do. They were intended to elicit a clarification. How do we understand this? And the punchline to the whole thing is there's been no answer to it. Now, read into that what you will. People have different theories as to why Pope Francis has not deigned to respond to it. I mean, he's the Pope and I'm not, so far be it from me to sit in judgment of him. But it is curious. That's the thing I will say. It is curious. It is unprecedented, as far as I'm aware, that something as basic and simple and otherwise cut and dried is not being responded to. And heaven only knows what the reasons are. I don't know, and I don't want to speculate or imagine that I do know, but that's where things stand. So there's a long, tedious, voluminous answer to your very short question, Joe. That's the background to the dubia, and as of today, nearly 4 years, or roughly 4 years since they were issued, there has been no answer. And I hope that someday there will be an answer, but thus far there hasn't been an answer. Does that make sense, Joe?
That does. That makes a lot more sense, and I appreciate you going down the tedious road of kind of explaining that to me. That was very helpful.
Thank you. So, one thing I'll just add is, because many people are tempted to attack, whether it's Pope Francis or whomever, and my advice would be, let's take Pope Francis at his request. He always says, please pray for me, please pray for me, please. Okay, so let's do that. Let's pray really hard for Pope Francis. I do every day, every single day, especially in my rosary, I pray for Pope Francis. Lord, give him clarity of mind, give him courage of conviction. Help him to be the best Pope possible. And I would pray that for anybody who's Pope. Any Pope deserves those prayers. And we really have an obligation to pray for the Pope. So regardless of how the situation with the dubia makes you feel or what emotions it might engender, just pray for the Pope. Put those emotions and that energy into action by praying for the Pope every single day. Pray, pray, pray. Thanks, Joe.
For more of The Patrick Madrid Show, visit relevantradio.com/Patrick.